Hey storyteller, have you ever heard a robot in a movie or maybe a talking gadget with a voice that never changed? Maybe its voice didn't rise or lower at the ends of sentences, so you had no idea whether it was making a statement or asking a question. It never paused where we would put commas so all the words ran together like the sentence is right now. We do not want our characters to sound that way. Over the top or melodramatic dialogue is just as bad as stilted or boring conversations. So, how can we make sure our characters' discussions, arguments, and shared secrets sound natural? Dialogue attributions can do far more than just identifying the speaker. If we position them strategically, they can help us create a natural flow to our characters' conversations. Welcome to this week's writer coaching session. I'm Bridget from B Squared Writer Coaching. I'm an author, editor, and your story coach, here to help you make your story powerful, polished, and publishable so you can move readers and help them experience your characters' adventures with maximum emotional impact. Before we discuss how to make our dialogue sound more natural, I have a gift for you just for visiting my channel, the ultimate guide to dialogue punctuation. Even the most natural sounding dialogue can still confuse or frustrate readers if it isn't structured or punctuated correctly. So check out this resource for all the rules with easy to follow examples. Just click the link in the description or visit b2writercoaching.com/dialogue. That's the letter B, the number 2, writercoaching.com/dialogue to download your copy. And be sure to stick around to the end of the video so you won't miss this week's Power Up, a super practical action step you can take right now in the scene you're working on. For the bulk of this coaching session, we'll be discussing the placement of dialogue attributions. If you aren't familiar with that term or need a refresher, check out the video linked above on how to structure dialogue attributions. I'll also link it in the description. The first 3 tips I'll share with you relate to the things we can do in order to create a natural flow with our dialogue. The last 3 will be things we need to avoid that can interrupt the flow. Dialogue tags create natural pauses between lines of characters' speech, but how can we decide where in a paragraph to place them? Here's an example. "Let's go out for dinner," Susan said. "I'm in the mood for pizza." In this example, the tag is placed at the end of the first sentence of dialogue. "Let's go out for dinner" is the dialogue. Then we have a comma and the tag, "Susan said." If we placed the tag at the beginning of the second sentence of dialogue, however, this would create an unnaturally long pause between the first line of dialogue and the speaker attribution, "Susan said." For example, "Let's go out for dinner. Susan said, I'm in the mood for pizza." Notice in this example, "Susan said" starts the second sentence. Then we have a comma and her second line of dialogue, "I'm in the mood for pizza." A period creates a longer pause than a comma. So let's be strategic in how we place those tags so that the punctuation gives the reader a clue of how long the pause should be. Which one sounds more natural? "Let's go out for dinner," Susan said. "I'm in the mood for pizza." Notice the longer pause after "said" between "said" and "I'm" in that for the second line of dialogue versus "Let's go out for dinner. Susan said, I'm in the mood for pizza." This can not only create an awkwardness to the flow, but it can create confusion for the reader, especially if the reader is listening to the story read like in an audiobook, because the "let's go out for dinner" part, since there's such a long pause between that and "Susan said," the reader might think a different character is saying that second line than the one who spoke the first line. In the case of dialogue tags, how can you tell if you've placed your tag in the best or most natural sounding position? Well, you can perform what I call the read aloud test. You can either read your dialogue out loud, putting the appropriate length of pause with the commas and periods in your conversation, or you can have someone else read the dialogue to you who's never read it before. And a third option is to have your computer's text-to-speech component read for you. Most computers do include one of these, whether it's Windows or Mac, and you can Google how that works for your particular model of computer. But this can be a really good way to tell if things flow naturally, because a computer is a robotic voice and they do have a little bit of inflection with it, but a computer will pause longer for periods usually than it will for commas. The second type of dialogue attribution that can either enhance or destroy flow is the action beat. Usually, when we're using action beats, the conversation will flow much better if we place the action before the character's line of dialogue. That way, we see who's speaking before the person starts to talk. If the action beat is placed after the line of dialogue, it can make a reader wonder, especially if they're listening to the story, like we said earlier in an audiobook, it can make the reader wonder whether the character who's doing the action is the one who spoke that first line of dialogue, or that character doing the action is someone else who's going to speak the next line of dialogue. We'll look at an example of it structured both ways in just a moment. But the easiest way to tell whether your action beat is placed where it should be is to, again, perform that read aloud test to see where the pauses go and if the placement causes possible confusion for the reader, or if it's really obvious that the person doing the action is also the person who is speaking the words that come before it. Now, of course, when a reader is looking at the story on the page, the dialogue paragraphing will indicate which character is speaking and which lines of dialogue go with the action, because we do need to create a new paragraph for each new speaker. So if one person is speaking and then another person does an action, we need a new paragraph for that other character's action and his or her lines that may follow. But if a reader is listening to it, again, that can be confusing if the action is placed in a weird position in relation to the line of dialogue. But you might be thinking, well, I probably won't be creating an audiobook version of this story. Even if you aren't going to do that, the placement of these action beats and dialogue tags still can make or break the flow of the dialogue. You know how it should sound in your head, but a reader who is reading this for the first time on the page doesn't know how you're interpreting it, and so it's going to be up to that reader's interpretation. So we want to do everything we can to make this flow as naturally as possible, and to do that, I advise using the same methods that we would when creating a story that readers would listen to, because it's just going to inherently have a better flow that way. Here's an example that I will show it on the screen after I read it, but first maybe just close your eyes and listen to it and to see if this sounds confusing as to who's speaking and who's doing the action. She's due at the end of summer, I think, Robin said. I don't know exactly when. Are you going to help her when the baby comes? Sarah shook a bug off her skirt. I think so. A person who's just listening to this might think Robin is asking Sarah if she plans to go help. The question about going to help would run together with Robin's previous statement about not knowing the exact due date. For a revision, we can rearrange Sarah's action to come before her question about whether Robin is going to help in order to create a more natural flow. She's due at the end of summer, I think, Robin said. I don't know exactly when. Sarah shook a bug off her skirt. Are you going to help? I think so. Here we are alerted to Sarah's action right before she asks her question, so we know she's the one speaking. Are you finding this helpful? If so, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you won't miss future writer coaching sessions. The third thing we can do in order to create a natural flow in our dialogue is to vary the type of speaker attributions we use. We wouldn't want to always use dialogue tags or always use action beats, or use too many of one type in a row, and we definitely wouldn't want to always use combinations of the two. In general, in writing, it is a good idea to vary the sentence structure, not just with dialogue, but even in the prose part of the story. It's also a good idea to vary the placement of the dialogue attributions, whether before, between lines of dialogue, or after the lines of dialogue, depending on which type of attribution you're using to create a good flow and those natural pauses we talked about. Here's an example. Susan grabbed her keys. Let's go out for dinner. Where? Joe asked, jumping to his feet. I think, she said, grinning at him, I'm in the mood for pizza. As we said before, we want to place our attributions strategically to create natural pauses in the dialogue. But if we use only dialogue tags, we will create what we call talking heads, which is characters speaking but no action. So the reader doesn't know what's happening. We just are reading a bunch of dialogue. Like the character's head's floating in space and we don't see what they're doing. Here's an example. Susan said, "Let's go out for dinner." "Where?" Joe asked. She said, "I think I'm in the mood for pizza." What are these people doing? I mean, we really have no idea. And the conversation becomes quite boring. However, using only action beats will create choppy writing. For example, Susan grabbed her keys. "Let's go out for dinner." "Where?" Joe jumped to his feet. She grinned at him. "I think I'm in the mood for pizza." Always using a combination of action beats and tags can make the writing cumbersome. Can you imagine an entire page full of dialogue like this? Susan grabbed her keys and said, "Let's go out for dinner." "Where?" Joe asked, jumping to his feet. She grinned at him and said, "I think I'm in the mood for pizza." Now let's discuss 3 flow-destroying things we want to avoid in our dialogue. The first is too much direct address. When one character calls another by name within the dialogue, the reader gets a clear picture of who is speaking and to whom. This can be really important, especially if there are multiple characters in your scene. For example, Joe glanced away from the waiter. "What do you want to order, Susan?" The waiter sighed. "Look, lady, I need to know what you want." In the first example, Joe actually speaks Susan's name. "What do you want to order, Susan?" In the second example, the waiter calls Susan lady. That's still direct address because the waiter is using an identifying label to indicate who she's speaking to. Direct address is not a speaker attribution, but it can have the same positive or negative effect on the flow of conversation as tags and action beats can. But keep in mind that people in real life do not speak each other's names often or sometimes at all during a conversation, especially if there are only 2 characters speaking. Use direct address only when necessary. For example, if the speaker is calling a character by name for emphasis, like a mother trying to get a child to obey might use the child's name, or a character who's confused about something might say, "What are you talking about, Mary?" Or if the speaker needs to get the other character's attention, like the other person's back is turned or they're across the room, and so the speaker would need to say that person's name. And the third option is if there are more than 2 characters in a scene and there really isn't another way to indicate who the speaker is talking to. The second thing we want to avoid in our dialogue to keep it sounding natural is mundane or meaningless exchanges. Like, "Hi, how are you?" or talking about the weather or things like that. Yes, we may do that in our real conversations, but in fiction or in storytelling in general, even in nonfiction, we need to only use the words in our characters' conversations that have a point to the story. So starting with, "Hey, how are you?" and talking about that kind of thing it has no significance to the plot, nor does it reveal character or develop relationships or any of the other purposes that we have for using dialogue in our stories. Plus, it's just boring to read. The third thing to avoid is having one character tell another what they both already know. This is often used in order to try to avoid an info dump or backstory dump where the author stops the story for a couple paragraphs or even a paragraph to inform the reader about something. And so writers trying to avoid doing that may disguise it or try to disguise it as dialogue. But keep in mind, you want to keep your dialogue natural to the way people would actually talk to each other. So if you and I are friends and we've both experienced the same event, I'm not going to sit there and rehash it with you and say, "Well, yesterday when we went to the concert," and on and on. You see what I mean? So yeah, we want to avoid thinly disguised information dumps in dialogue. If you haven't done so yet, be sure to download your Ultimate Guide to Dialogue Punctuation so your natural sounding character conversations won't be riddled with errors. For today's Power Up, look at a section of dialogue from your story and try to note where you've used dialogue tags, where you've used action beats or combinations of the two, and see if you're kind of tending to use the same one over and over. If you find that that is the case, revise your dialogue to vary the type of speaker attribution you're using. Also, do the read aloud test to make sure that the flow is sounding natural and the attributions are positioned in the best way to create a good flow to the conversation. Once you polish up your dialogue and the rest of your story, you may be ready for publication. To do so, you'll need to write a query letter. If you're wondering what that is and how to construct one, you're not alone. We'll discuss all that in next week's writer coaching session, so be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss it. Speaking of polishing up your story, check out this playlist for more self-editing tips. And in case you missed last week's writer coaching session, watch this video to find out how to make sure readers know which character is speaking in your dialogue. Now let's power up your storytelling.